And right now I am joined by Congressman Gerald Nadler, Democrat of New York, Heather McGhee, Director of the Washington office of the progressive think tank Demos, Michelle Goldberg, Senior Contributing Writer for Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and joining us for the first time, I'm really happy to have him, Josh Barro, contributor to the National Review Online, a senior fellow at the conservative think tank, the Manhattan Institute. It's great to have you all here this morning. All right, a month away today from the Iowa caucus, events in the Republican primary developing quickly. We got word yesterday, I love this. We got word yesterday that Donald Trump has plans to host a GOP debate in late December, which prompted National Review news editor Daniel Foster to tweet, "Trump, eh? Crap. Maybe everything they say about us is true." Also, we're awaiting that major announcement from Herman Cain around noon today. Cain has said he'll clarify whether he will abandon his presidential campaign. Speculation he's ending his campaign is rife. Meanwhile, Mitt Romney's cloak of inevitability, I feel, appears to be fading a bit. And one of the interesting developments, I think, is that as we cycled through the boom-bust, which has been the kind of defining characteristic of the Republican race so far, there's Romney, who stays at around 20% in the polls, and then a series of candidates who inflate like the housing bubble and then crash like the financial crisis. Michelle Bachmann, Rick Perry, Herman Cain, Newt Gingrich is now atop that. But Romney had sort of a rough week, and his sort of the main attack on Romney, which is the changing of positions, is now is the underlying critique. But there's also the fact that he's gotten kind of testy in a bunch of interactions, and he had this fascinating interview with Fox News, which I want to play a clip of, with Bret Baier, in which Baier asked him some good, tough questions, and Romney did not take kindly to it. Check it out.
How can voters trust what they hear from you today is what you will believe if you win the White House?
Well, Bret, your list is just not accurate. So, one, we're going to have to be better informed about my views on issues. Bret, I don't know how many hundred times I've said this, too. This is an unusual interview. All right, let's do it again. You're wrong, Bret.
No, there's tape out there.
No, the tape out there, continue to read the tape. And the tape goes on to say, for each state to be able to look at it.
We're going to have to get better informed on issues. That is, I would not use a tone that patronizing with my 6-day-old baby. I was really sort of struck by that. Michelle, you've been covering the GOP race. We were just talking about it a little bit before we got on air. And I mean, what struck me about this interview was the remarkable thing is Mitt Romney's basically been running for president for 5 years and hasn't really had to do that much work to defend himself because of the bizarre circus-like quality of the race so far.
The other thing is that, because Mitt Romney's been in the public eye for so long, we kind of assume that he's a career politician, and he is a career politician, but he's kind of a career losing politician, right? He's only ever won one race. And, he kind of uses that to say, well, I spent most of my life in the private sector. No, he didn't. He spent most of his life running for political office and losing. He's not that good.
Right. Congressman, you're a very successful professional politician. You've been reelected numerous times. How closely have you been following the GOP race? I'm sort of curious how much it sort of penetrates on Capitol Hill.
I actually have not been following it all that closely. Every time I look at it, I see people saying things that I regard as nonsense and as just wrong economically, et cetera, and I figure we'll have to engage with them somewhat later. So I haven't followed it that closely, but it's been striking about the candidate of the month going up and going down. It does seem to be coming down to Newt and Romney now, and it may come down to those two, if only because there's nobody else to be the next up and coming for a month.
Yeah, I mean, they've just sort of cycled through. I think the interesting thing about the Newt, I'm fascinated by the Newt phenomenon, partly because I think that part of the reason that Romney is now getting a little more scrutiny is because Newt feels like a more serious candidate for whatever that means.
But think about what that means. He's like the more serious candidate.
Well, what does it mean?
But you got to remember something. Newt Gingrich is someone else who's been a career politician, and for quite a while a very successful one, but not in the last 15 years.
Right.
He's been out of office since, 1998. Prior to that, and people don't really know him anymore. I mean, younger people don't know him. But those of us who served with him know him, and he's a very interesting character.
Say more. Elaborate, Congressman. Interesting is an interesting choice of words.
Well, you used the word patronizing, for instance. When he would... he had one tremendous accomplishment to which you cannot take away from him. The Democrats dominated the House of Representatives, not politics, because the presidency was Democratic, Republican, back and forth, but they dominated the House, we did, Democrats, for 40 years.
Right.
Newt was instrumental in breaking that up and bringing the Republicans into power in 1994. And if you think that's a good thing, he deserves tremendous credit. If you think it's a bad thing, it's unfortunate, but it probably wouldn't have happened without him. And he did that in several ways. And a lot of the problems in American politics today, the incivility, he deliberately engineered. Because he determined, and he said so at the time, he said that if the Republican minority leadership cooperated to achieve things with Democrats, they'd never get power. What they had to do was to take over the institution was to blow it up. And he proceeded to do exactly that. He forced out the old Republican leadership. Minority Leader Michael didn't run for re-election in 1994 because he would have lost to Newt for Minority Leader. And when he came in, well, even before that, he started accusing Democrats of all kinds of terrible things. He made scandals, sometimes deserved, mostly where they weren't. He sent out tape cassettes for a period of years in the 80s to young Republicans, young Americans for Freedom, anybody, advice on how to run a campaign.
Right.
And one of the tape cassettes said things like how to refer to yourself, what phrases to use, entrepreneurial, creative, forward-looking, whatever. How to refer to your Democratic opponent, statist, collectivist, communist, corrupt. Now, how did he know that the Democratic candidate for dog catcher
exactly.
corrupt?
Right.
In other words, he was just saying, call your opponent corrupt, make a scandal, allege it whether it was there or not, and he brought a huge amount of this into politics.
This
wasn't there before.
This is very instructive because you've made a point that I hadn't quite thought of in these terms, which is that what we see now in the way the Republican House behaves and the way Republicans on Capitol Hill behave, which is that they've made largely a judgment that cooperation of any kind is against their political interest, was pioneered by Newt Gingrich. We live in Newt's world in many
yes,
ways.
And then there's another thing. You referred to Mitt Romney as patronizing. Well, patronizing is Newt Gingrich to a large extent. When he was elected Speaker, he used to hold press conferences in which he would instruct people. He said, all of you, the public at large, politicians, members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, here's a list of books you ought to read. And he told us.
We're going to have to get better informed on our history.
But that's part of why it seems like he's surging. I mean, besides just being the last man standing, is that there's this, I think, insane view among parts of the right that Obama really is a deeply stupid man. They really believe that he's an empty suit who needs a teleprompter, and that the brilliant Newt Gingrich is going to wipe the floor with him in these debates and finally show the world what a fraud he is. I mean, I think that delusion has a lot to do with his surge.
Josh, do you think that's part of what's driving the...
I think that's absolutely right. And I think the other thing is that you've seen these flavor of the month candidates in the Republican primary. They all get felled because they're not very good on their feet. They're frankly not bright in a lot of cases, like Rick Perry. And so I think Gingrich can hold his own in these debates. Someone described him as a dumb person's idea of what a smart person looks like. And so I think that, the other candidates are afraid to gang up on him because they think they will lose in rhetorical exchanges. So I think that's his strength in this primary. And I think you're absolutely right that Republican base voters have a misconception that Gingrich will mop the floor with Obama in debates.
We're going to dig deeper into the appeal of Newt Gingrich right after this break.
Whereas I would have thought originally it was going to be Mitt and not Mitt. I think it may turn out to be Newt and not Newt.
It's former Speaker of the House and current GOP presidential candidate Newt Gingrich, who I don't think anyone has ever accused of being excessively humble, talking about what the race will come down to. Josh, you talked about the appeal of Newt Gingrich. You had a tweet the other day saying that you basically thought that Gingrich is a sham as a debater, that he's actually not that good, that he's essentially bluffing his way to appear good.
He is, but it's the field is weak enough that he can get away with that, and so I think that he's an intellectual poser. Mm-hmm. He can spout a lot of facts facts and a lot of historical examples, but it's not actually a coherent story.
Let me quickly defend Newt and also make a point about Mitt Romney. One, to defend Newt, the one thing I love about him, this is my favorite Newt fact, is that he's an obsessive reviewer of books on Amazon. Did you know this?
Yeah.
Someone once wrote a story in which they reviewed all, and he just goes on Amazon when he reads a book and like just random books and goes on Amazon. It's like, well, I didn't think this was very good, which I find extremely endearing. That's my favorite thing about Newt Gingrich. But also, I think Newt Gingrich he's a fascinating, compelling figure in a way that Mitt Romney is not. And to just as an example of that, in my rundown sheet, we were going to talk about Romney for the first block, and we couldn't sustain 90 seconds on him, which I think sort of epitomizes the problem. Michelle.
Well, I just want about Newt as kind of a supposed, deeply grounded historical thinker. One of the things, he gets a lot of credit for citing sometimes obscure historical examples, or, I think the New York Times did a story where they kind of marveled over his constant references to the Northwest Frontier Ordinance.
Right.
And if you spend very much time, as I unfortunately have at parts of my life, reading a lot of kind of right-wing pseudo-history, and particularly Christian right pseudo-history, this is a staple of those books. So often what kind of masquerades as being intelligent, intelligent examples plucked from his deep knowledge are really just kind of staples of the higher wingnut canon. You hear the same thing when he's always talking about Chile and Chile's health insurance,
Social Security and health insurance
programs.
Right.
Yeah, people say, "Oh, he must be incredibly well versed." No, it's just Chile is just the kind of go-to right-wing example for their kind of social insurance.
And Gingrich, of course, Heather, he's had these comments this week about how poor kids don't have work habits and they should be the janitors and mop up the floor. And he also, he appeals to a certain kind of sort of welfare queenist vision that is very popular on the right. I mean, he was, of course, the original mastermind of getting rid of welfare as we know it.
Absolutely, and I think it's going to be a real question whether that, which is real red meat to the conservative base, the idea that we should be blaming downwards, that poverty is trickling up instead of, in fact, the lack of opportunity is the result of trickle-down policies. But it's going to be a question whether that would ever play in a general election in a time when we've got such incredible economic insecurity up and down the income ladder. I mean, I think Buddy Roemer said this great thing this week.
Buddy Roemer, who is former governor of Louisiana, running for president. We've had him on the show. He's actually been one of our best guests. Continue.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that you have to remind people that he's
that's right.
for president. But he said, Mitt Romney represents the 1%. And Newt Gingrich is their lobbyist. That's what he said. Right?
Don't hurt him, buddy. Don't hurt him. Congressman Nadler, one of the things I think that's interesting also is that Gingrich came, his rise was in 1994. And we see a lot of reporting on this station. We talk about it here on this network about the sort of move to the right of the Republican Party. And I wonder, Gingrich, of course, was the furthest right that anyone had ever seen at the time. He embodied, the right, and his class of freshmen were the vanguard of this. And now the center has shifted even further. And I wonder if he's exposed ideologically.
Well, I think both he and Romney are exposed ideologically. You take, for instance, the individual mandate on health care. If 20 years ago you had said to some on a show like this, you'd said, what's the Democratic position on health care reform going to be? He would have said, well, maybe it'll be some sort of single-payer system or Medicare for all or something. All right, what'll be the Republican position? Well, the Republican position will probably be a mandate that people get insurance from private insurance companies, do it privately. People can't afford to pay, maybe you'll give them some sort of subsidy. And that, in fact, was what was proposed by the Republicans. It was the Dole-Chafee bill in 1994, I think, which was in 93, which was in opposition to what Hillary was saying at the time. The individual mandate actually was first dreamed up by the Heritage Foundation. Gingrich supported it. Senator Hatch introduced it. Now these are wild left-wing ideas, I think. But these ideas originally came out of the Republicans.
And Gingrich was on board with them.
And Gingrich was on board with them, and a few years later, Romney was on board with them. But now that everything has shifted, now they're trying to deny what were at that time conservative positions.
Here's Ron Paul. Ron Paul put out a really sort of brutal attack ad on Gingrich, essentially pursuing exactly this line. Here's a little clip.
Beyond the words is a real question of policy and a real question of values and a real question of seriousness.
thing that Gingrich railed against when he was in the House. He went the other way when he got paid to go the other way.
You're an embarrassment to our party.
He's flipped and flopped based on who's paying him.
He's demonstrating himself to be the very essence of the Washington insiders.
It's about serial hypocrisy.
It's wrong to go around and adopt radically different positions, because then people have to ask themselves, what will you tell me next time?
That's Ron Paul hard-hitting out on Newt Gingrich. And the thing to me about at this point on Newt Gingrich is, you know, Josh, I'm curious to hear what you, to me, and I said something about this the other day, you know, there's a core of the Tea Party complaint about Washington in the post-bailout era that I find compelling. And the core of that complaint is about the kind of cronyist complex around Washington, D.C., the kind of lobbyist industrial complex, the sense that big government and big business are together and making all these backroom deals and screwing people. And and Tim Carney, who's had on the show, reports on this, and he reports on people leaving the Senate and the Congress and going to lobby, and from the perspective of the right? And I find that core complaint compelling. To me, if the Tea Party base of the GOP rallies around Newt Gingrich, it completely invalidates that critique, because he is the absolute symbol of that corrupt system.
Well, yeah, and I think we'll see over the next month whether Gingrich is able to maintain his position because of that, because I think there's a lot of really damaging oppo on him. I mean, getting $1.6 million from Freddie Mac to be a historian for them. Right. And there's this speech he gave, I believe, in 2007, where he's talking about how the GSE model is great.
This is the government-sponsored enterprise, Fannie and Freddie.
Right, exactly. And, it's a useful vehicle for promoting homeownership, which is an appropriate policy goal, and maybe we should also have a GSE for health care. So I think as this stuff trickles out, you're right that it's antithetical to the positions of the Tea Party. The question is whether he can dance his way around it effectively. I think there's something similar with Newt Gingrich and Chris Christie, which I'm hesitant to say because I like Chris Christie, but they both have this attitude that conservatives read as them being strong
ideologically conservative.
Right. And it allows them to get away with actual substantive ideological, deviances.
It's like if you enrage liberals enough, you must be really conservative.
Right, exactly.
But even more than that, isn't? I mean, beyond that, it's not just kind of if you enrage conservatives enough. It's that I think that they don't doubt that despite these deviations, there is a kind of solid right-wing core, and even more than that, that he kind of channels their sense of apocalypticism over this current administration. Whereas, Romney might have really kind of consistently conservative critiques, but Newt Gingrich seems to truly loathe Obama and to kind of capture that loathing, and also to put it in terms of kind of a civilizational battle.
And he hates the media, which the base loves.
And he's played that card quite a bit.
Right, exactly.
We're going to come back after this, talk about Herman Cain, give him a brief. I don't want to say we're going to have a wake for Herman Cain's campaign because we don't know what he's going to announce, but we'll talk about Herman Cain after this break. We've got Congressman Gerald Nadler of New York here at the table, who's just telling us off break he's a fan of Newt Gingrich's alternative history fiction, which I thought was interesting, right? You give him a thumbs up on the
I enjoyed his fiction book. But then again, a lot of his politics is fiction, so.
Well played, sir. So Herman Cain has this announcement today at noon, and let's be honest here. The Herman Cain campaign is over whether he knows it or not. It's essentially a ghost dance at this point, whether he announces at noon that he's discontinuing or not. We've seen all the polling, all the string of accusations and we should make a very important moral distinction between sexual harassment and the use of power of one's station to essentially intimidate women into some kind of sexual interaction because you are their boss and you hold power of a job over them, and an allegation of a consensual affair, which happened outside of those terms, which I believe are on very different moral planes. But whatever, no one seems to make that distinction. Just want to make it. But the string of these allegations seem to have built up, and I think Heather McGhee. What should we write on the tombstone of the Herman Cain campaign?
I actually think of all of the flameouts, Herman Cain, whom I never believed in, call me a black woman in America, but I that he was going to be the Tea Party candidate. Actually, we had a conversation because of Herman Cain about policy. We had a conversation about tax policy, whether it should be entirely flat. We started looking into the details of the 999 plan. I mean, Rick Perry, we didn't have a policy conversation. In Bachmann, we didn't have a policy conversation. As a policy person, that mattered.
I thought that's a really interesting point, and I also think that but I think actually he's had a pernicious effect, which is he has played the role of John Edwards in this Republican primary, which is that he has, and I don't mean in that way. I realize as you made a sad face, right? I guess I should distinguish. He has played the role of John Edwards in this way, which is that John Edwards' campaign released a whole bunch of pretty aggressive, quite progressive, substantive policy proposals, which were then sort of aped by the other campaigns.
Right.
Heather McGhee, you had a hand in crafting some of those. You were working on that campaign. And I feel like the 999 plan sort of caught fire, and we've seen a string of flat tax proposals. Rick Perry has a flat tax proposal. John Huntsman has a sort of flat tax proposal. Newt Gingrich has a sort of flat tax proposal. So I think it's been pernicious. Josh, do you think that the flat tax is going to be something that we see the eventual nominee rally around?
No. Well, first of all, I don't think he created that interest, because you have flat taxes going all the way back to Forbes,
right?
And John Huntsman's plan isn't a flat tax; it's a two-rate system. It's similar to the proposal that Paul Ryan had put out.
It's flatter.
The problem with the political problem with a flat tax is that any flat tax proposal has to be either a huge net tax cut that blows a big hole in the deficit, or a major tax increase for about 80-85% of Americans, or both. And so it sounds good at first, but a nominee can't run on it because ultimately those things get pointed out, as they did with 999, which is why the other candidates were attacking 999. They were saying this is a bad tax plan, and they came up with plans that in most cases were actually not as substantively bad as 999 in those regards. But I don't think that ultimately the nominee can't run on it because it's not a general election proposal.
Michelle Goldberg, what is our lesson from the Herman campaign?
Well, actually, I think the lesson is that a failed presidential campaign could be an excellent business strategy. I mean, I've kind of seen all along this as being a kind of publicity stunt that's got out of control, which is why he probably never could have anticipated that he would have gotten high enough to have his sexual history investigated. But, I actually have a piece coming out when I've been speaking to, he presents himself as a big tycoon, and he's a very rich man, but he's not as rich as he's made out to be. I mean, he's a very successful motivational speaker. That's been his job for the last few years. And I think he's worth somewhere between $2.8, $6.5 million. A lot of money, but not a huge amount of money by Republican politician standards. And so he was getting $25,000 a speech. I spoke to speaking agents, actually, who told me that coming out of the campaign, he's set up to get more like $50,000 or $75,000. I think Sarah Palin kind of blazed a trail of a failed political, or in her case, vice presidential campaign, but a failed campaign with a lot of demagoguery is an incredibly lucrative proposition.
And Newt's been getting $60,000.
Yeah, exactly.
And this gets to something deeply, I think, corrupt about the American elite and political establishment, and this goes across both parties, which is that everybody cashes out. There is a paycheck waiting for you when you leave public service to chill for people, to go, to be part of a hedge fund as a consultant, to go work in private equity, to do now. And some of these jobs are perfectly good jobs, or some of them might be socially useful, but a lot of them have to do with essentially taking the influence you have and the connections you have and monetizing that in a way that I think.
I would object to what you said only for the word everybody.
Yeah.
It's not true for everybody. There are people in American politics in both parties who are sufficiently independent and don't serve the interests so that they don't have great jobs waiting for them.
Russ Feingold, who I want to shout out because he left and he did not do that, and he went back.
And on the Republican side, Chris Shays, when he was defeated for re-election a number of years ago, I think he had a tough time finding a job after a while because he couldn't crash because he was too independent and against it was for campaign finance reform and that sort of thing.